The dust hung thick in the summer air, red as dried blood under the merciless Texas sun. Grace Sullivan pressed her face against the wagon's rough wooden slats, trying to catch a glimpse of the world beyond her rolling prison. Through the gaps, she could see the endless stretch of sage and mesquite, broken only by the occasional shadow of a circling vulture. "Sit back, girl. Mrs." Henrietta Blackwood's voice cracked like a whip from the front of the wagon. "No use gawking. You'll see plenty of nothing soon enough." Grace pulled away from the wall, but kept her eyes on the landscape. 22 years of life, most spent within the confining walls of the Sisters of Mercy orphanage. And now this sold like cattle to some rancher who needed a companion for his mountain homestead. The word tasted bitter in her mouth. Everyone knew what companion meant when a young woman was purchased sight unseen. The wagon lurched over a particularly deep rut, sending Grace sliding across the bench, her wrists bound loosely with rope more for show than restraint. As Mrs. Blackwood had pointed out, there was nowhere to run in this wasteland chafed against the coarse fibers. "How much further?" Grace asked, her voice hoarse from the dust. "Monroe's place sits high on the pine ridge," Mrs. Blackwood replied without turning. "Another hour, maybe 2 if this storm catches us." Grace looked to the horizon, where dark clouds gathered like an army massing for attack. The first drops of rain would be a blessing after the oppressive heat, but she'd learned enough about flash floods in the arroyos to know they could turn deadly quick. As they climbed higher into the foothills, the landscape began to change. Scrub pine appeared among the rocks, and the air carried a hint of resin that cut through the dust. They passed the burned shell of a homestead, its blackened timbers reaching skyward like accusing fingers. In what might have been the front yard, a child's porcelain doll lay half buried in ash, its painted face cracked down the middle. Grace's throat tightened. How many dreams had died in that fire? "Raiders, Mrs." Blackwood said, following Grace's gaze. "Or lightning, makes no difference to the dead." The wagon trail narrowed as they climbed, winding between boulder-strewn slopes. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the horses picked up their pace, sensing shelter ahead. Then, through a gap in the pines, Grace saw a low-slung cabin of rough-hewn logs, its tin roof glinting dully under the darkening sky. Smoke drifted from a stone chimney, the only sign of life in this desolate place. Mrs. Blackwood pulled the team to a halt in the dusty yard. "Monroe," she called out, "I've brought your delivery." The word delivery made Grace's skin crawl, but she kept her face carefully neutral. She'd learned at the orphanage that showing fear only invited worse treatment. The cabin door opened, and a man emerged onto the covered porch. Grace's first thought was that he looked nothing like the lecherous old rancher she'd imagined during the long journey. Elijah Monroe appeared to be in his early 30s, tall but bent slightly to one side, favoring his left leg. His face bore the weathered look of a man who'd seen too much sun and too much trouble, with lines etched deep around gray eyes that seemed to take in everything and give nothing back. He wore simple work clothes, cotton shirt, worn denims, boots that had seen better days, and leaned heavily on a carved walking stick. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, his voice low and rough as gravel. No greeting, no pleasantries, just acknowledgement. "Mr. Monroe." The woman climbed down from the wagon seat with surprising agility for her bulk. As promised, young, healthy, knows her letters and numbers, trained in household duties by the sisters themselves. Monroe's gaze shifted to Grace, still sitting in the wagon bed. She met his eyes steadily, refusing to look away despite the fear coiling in her stomach. Something flickered across his face, surprise, perhaps, or disappointment. It was gone before she could name it. "What's your name?" he asked. "Grace Sullivan, sir." He nodded once, then turned back to Mrs. Blackwood. "The payment's inside. I'll get it." As he limped back toward the cabin, Grace noticed the way his left foot dragged slightly, the careful way he placed the walking stick with each step. A war wound, perhaps, or an accident with horses, Mrs. Blackwood untied Grace's wrists and helped her down from the wagon, none too gently. "Remember what I told you," the woman hissed in Grace's ear. "You run. There's nowhere to go but into the desert to die. You cause trouble. You'll wish you'd taken the desert, mister." Monroe paid good money for a companion, and companions know their place. Grace said nothing, rubbing feeling back into her wrists. The first fat raindrops began to fall, kicking up small puffs of dust in the yard. Monroe returned with a leather pouch that clinked heavily. He handed it to Mrs. Blackwood without counting the contents, a man who kept his word. Then the woman tested the weight, nodded her satisfaction, and climbed back onto the wagon. "She's all yours, Mr. Monroe. Use her as you see fit." With a snap of the reins, she was gone, the wagon disappearing down the trail as the rain began in earnest. Grace stood in the yard, her thin dress quickly soaking through, watching her last connection to the world she knew vanish into the storm. "Come inside," Monroe said. "No sense catching your death on the first day." Grace followed him into the cabin, blinking as her eyes adjusted to the dimness. The interior was sparse but clean, a main room with a stone fireplace, a rough table and chairs, shelves lined with a few books and supplies. Through one doorway she glimpsed a kitchen, through another what must be a bedroom. The air smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and something else, loneliness. Perhaps, if loneliness had a scent. Monroe moved to a third door she hadn't noticed, opening it to reveal a small room with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window looking out toward the pine-covered slopes. "This is yours," he said. Grace stared, certain she'd misheard. "Mine?" "Your room. There's water in the pitcher, and I'll bring some dry clothes. They were my mother's, but they should fit well enough." He paused in the doorway, not quite meeting her eyes. "Kitchen work starts at dawn. You'll tend the chickens, help with the horses when needed, washing on Mondays, mending when there's time. That clear?" Yes, but I thought—" Grace stumbled over the words, confusion warring with relief. "I know what you thought." His voice hardened slightly. "What Mrs. Blackwood led you to believe, but I have no interest in unwilling companions. Miss Sullivan, I needed help with the ranch. Nothing more. You'll work for your keep, and you'll be treated fairly. That's all." He closed the door, leaving Grace alone in the small room. She sank onto the bed, mind reeling. No interest in unwilling companions. The words should have brought pure relief, but instead she found herself wary. In her experience, when something seemed too good to be true, there was always a catch. Thunder crashed overhead, and rain hammered against the tin roof. Through the window, she could see the storm turning the dusty yard to mud, washing the world clean or trying to. Some stains, Grace knew, went too deep for any storm to wash away. She thought of the burned homestead, the broken doll in the ashes. Had that family thought they were safe too? Had they believed in new beginnings before the fire took everything? But what choice did she have outside was nothing but miles of desert and mountains. No town close enough to reach on foot. No one who would help a runaway companion. She was as trapped here as she'd been in the wagon. Only now her prison had walls of distance instead of wood. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Sullivan, I've left some things outside." She waited until his uneven footsteps faded before opening the door. A neat pile of clothing sat on the floor, a plain wool dress, undergarments, a shawl. Simple, practical things, with the faint scent of lavender from long storage. Grace gathered them up, closed the door, and began to change out of her soaked dress. As she buttoned the dry clothes, indeed a decent fit, if a bit loose, she wondered about the woman who'd worn them before. Monroe's mother. Dead now. Clearly. This whole place spoke of absence, of empty spaces where people should be. When she emerged from the room, Monroe sat at the table, a cup of coffee before him. He'd built up the fire, and warmth was beginning to seep into the cabin's corners. Without looking up, he gestured to the kitchen. "Coffee's hot. Beans and cornbread for supper, nothing fancy. Tomorrow I'll show you where everything is." Grace poured herself a cup, grateful for the warmth between her hands. The coffee was black, bitter, but it chased away the last of the road dust. She took a seat across from him, studying his profile in the firelight. Younger than she'd first thought, but worn down, like river rock ground smooth by endless water. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why pay for a companion if you don't want company?" He looked at her then, and she saw something raw in his gray eyes before he shuttered it away. Sometimes a man needs help that doesn't come with questions or pity. Someone who has their own reasons for being here, not charity cases or good Christian women looking to save a soul. Grace understood that, at least, the weight of other people's pity. Their need to fix you or save you she'd had her fill at the orphanage. "And Mrs. Blackwood knows to send me workers, not wives. Usually older women, widows looking for a place. But the drought's been hard. Fewer willing to come this far from town." He shrugged. "You were what was available." What was available? Like she was a cut of meat at the butcher's or a bolt of cloth at the general store. But then, wasn't that exactly what she'd been? They ate in silence, the simple food filling the hollow in her stomach. Outside, the storm raged on, but the cabin walls held firm against it. When they finished, Monroe showed her where things were kept: dishes, dry goods, the root cellar, the rain barrel. "Privy's out back," he said, then added with what might have been dry humor, "Mind the rattlesnakes. They like the warmth of the boards." As she prepared to retire, he stopped her with a gesture. From a high shelf, he took down something wrapped in oilcloth. "Can you shoot?" Grace shook her head. "I'll teach you, not for protection from me," he added quickly, seeing her expression. "But we're 15 miles from town, and not all visitors come with good intentions. A woman should know how to defend herself." He set the bundle on the table, but didn't unwrap it. "Tomorrow, then, after the morning chores." Grace nodded and returned to her room. As she lay in the narrow bed, listening to the rain drumming overhead, she tried to make sense of this strange turn her life had taken. Sold to a man who didn't want what he'd bought. Promised lessons in gunplay instead of the degradation she'd feared. Through the thin walls, she could hear Monroe moving about, the uneven rhythm of his steps, the scrape of his chair. Whatever had broken his body hadn't broken his pride. He moved like a man who'd learned to live with pain without letting it master him. The storm began to ease, thunder growing distant. In the relative quiet, Grace heard something else, the soft whinny of horses from what must be a barn, the rustle of wind in the pines, the sounds of a life carved out of wilderness, hard-won and precarious. She thought again of the burned homestead, the cracked doll's face. Everything here felt temporary, poised on the edge of disaster. But then, hadn't her whole life been that way? At least here, she might learn to shoot back at whatever came for her. As sleep finally took her, Grace's last thought was of Monroe's gray eyes and the weight of unspoken words. Whatever game he was playing, whatever he really wanted from her, she'd find out soon enough. For now, she had a roof, a bed, and the promise of being taught to defend herself. In a world that had shown her little kindness, it was more than she'd dared hope for. The first snow came early that year, dusting the pine ridge like flour on a kitchen table. Grace woke to a world transformed, the harsh edges of the landscape softened beneath a thin white blanket. She'd been at the Monroe Ranch for 3 months now, long enough to establish a rhythm of survival. But winter would test everything she'd learned. She dressed quickly in the cold room, grateful for the thick wool stockings and flannel petticoat Monroe had wordlessly left outside her door the week before. The man communicated in gestures more than words, a stack of firewood appearing before she asked. A heavy coat hung on the peg by the door when the temperature began to drop. The main room was already warm when she emerged, Monroe sitting by the fire with his coffee, his bad legs stretched toward the heat. He didn't look up, but she'd learned to read the slight relaxation in his shoulders as acknowledgement of her presence. "Morning," she said, moving to the kitchen to start breakfast. "Storm's coming," he replied. "Need to get the horses settled and check the roof patches before it hits." Grace had learned to gauge weather by his movements. The worse his leg hurt, the sooner the storm. This morning, he gripped his coffee cup white-knuckled, and she knew they were in for a hard blow. She set about making biscuits and gravy. The task's automatic now. The kitchen had become her domain, and she'd discovered an unexpected satisfaction in creating order from chaos, meals from simple ingredients, cleanliness from dirt, warmth from cold. "I'll help with the horses after breakfast," she said. Monroe grunted what might have been approval. Their conversations rarely extended beyond the practical, but Grace had begun to find comfort in the silence. After years of the orphanage's constant chatter and mandatory prayers, the quiet felt like freedom. They worked through the morning preparing for the storm. Grace had become proficient with the horses, learning their temperaments and quirks. The bay mare, Rosie, always tried to nip when her girth was tightened. The old gelding, Moses, needed extra encouragement on cold mornings. The young paint, Dancer, spooked at shadows but gentled under a firm hand. Monroe watched her work, occasionally offering a correction or suggestion. "Tighter on that knot," or "check his back hoof, he's been favoring it." She'd learned more about horses in 3 months than in her previous 22 years of life. By noon, the storm clouds had swallowed the mountains. They finished the last of the preparations, extra hay in the barn, water buckets filled and covered, loose boards secured. As they headed back to the cabin, the first heavy flakes began to fall. "Could last days," Monroe said, pausing to scan the darkening sky. "Hope you don't mind close quarters." Grace had survived worse confinements, though she didn't say so. The cabin might be small, but it was warm and dry. And her companion, for all his silences, had never made her feel unsafe. The blizzard struck in earnest that night. Wind howled around the cabin like a living thing, seeking entry through every crack and gap. Grace lay in her narrow bed, listening to the timbers creak and groan, wondering if the roof would hold. A crash from the main room brought her bolt upright. She grabbed the shawl and ventured out to find Monroe on the floor by the fireplace, his face contorted in pain. "Just my damn leg," he gritted out as she knelt beside him. "Tried to add wood to the fire. Gave out on me." Grace had never seen him this vulnerable. In 3 months, he'd never allowed her to witness his weakness, always managing his disability with stubborn independence. Now, in the flickering firelight, she saw the sheen of sweat on his forehead, the white-knuckled grip on his useless leg. "Let me help," she said quietly. "I can manage." "No." The firmness in her voice surprised them both. "You can't. Not tonight." For a long moment, they stared at each other. Then, something in his expression shifted, not quite surrender, but a crack in the wall he kept between them. Grace slipped her shoulder under his arm, helping him to his feet. He was heavier than expected, solid muscle despite the injury. Together, they made it to his chair by the fire. "The medicine," he said through clenched teeth. "Top shelf, kitchen, brown bottle." She found it laudanum. By the smell, she poured a careful measure into a glass of water and brought it to him. He drank without protest, another sign of how much pain he was in. "This happen often?" she asked, settling into the opposite chair. "When the weather changes, old wound has opinions about snow. War wound." He nodded, staring into the fire. "Chickamauga. Confederate cavalry saber took half the muscles in my thigh. Field surgeon wanted to take the whole leg. I convinced him otherwise." A bitter smile twisted his lips. "Some days I wonder if I made the right choice." It was the most he'd ever told her about himself. Grace sensed this was a rare window, opened by pain and laudanum. That might close at any moment. You were Union, she asked carefully. Illinois 15th Infantry, joined up believing in the cause, preserving the Union, freeing the slaves, all noble ideas from a distance. He shifted, trying to find a comfortable position. Up close, war's just mud and blood and boys screaming for their mothers. Grace said nothing, letting the silence invite more if he chose to fill it. Had a brother, he continued, voice growing softer. Samuel, year younger than me, followed me to war like he'd followed me everywhere since he could walk. I was supposed to protect him. The past tense told its own story. Grace watched the firelight play across Monroe's weathered features, saw the guilt etched deeper than any physical scar. Snipers got him at Kennesaw Mountain. Took me 3 hours to crawl to where he fell. 3 hours of him calling my name, and I couldn't. He stopped, jaw clenched against more than physical pain. Grace rose and added wood to the fire, giving him a moment to compose himself. The storm rattled the windows, reminding them both of the world outside their small circle of warmth. Is that why you came here? She asked eventually. To get away from the memories. Came here to die, if I'm honest. The laudanum was loosening his tongue now. Figured the desert would finish what the Confederates started, but I'm too stubborn to die easy. Turns out, so here I am, half a man on a failing ranch or hiring women I don't want because I need help. I'm too proud to ask for any other way. You're not half a man, Grace said quietly. He looked at her then. Really looked at her for perhaps the first time since she'd arrived. And what would you know about it? I know you get up every morning despite the pain. I know you treat me with respect when you had the power to do otherwise. I know you work harder with one good leg than most men do with two. She met his gaze steadily. Where I come from, that makes you more of a man than most I have known. Something passed between them in that moment. Not attraction, exactly, but recognition. Two damaged people acknowledging each other's struggles. Monroe looked away first. You should get some sleep. Storm's not letting up anytime soon. But Grace didn't move. Tell me about before, when you were young. He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, family had a farm in Illinois. Corn and hogs, mostly. Nothing fancy, but it was ours. Mother kept a garden that could feed an army. Father was strict but fair. Samuel and I would fish in the creek summers, trap rabbits winters. Ordinary life. Sounds nice. It was. His voice carried a weight of loss that made her chest ache. All gone now. Parents died while I was recovering from this. He gestured at his leg. Cholera took them both in a week. Farm went to creditors. Nothing to go back to even if I wanted. The wind picked up, driving snow against the windows with a sound like sand. The cabin creaked but held firm Monroe had built well. Whatever his claims of failure. Your turn, he said unexpectedly. How does a girl end up in Blackwood's hands? Grace pulled her shawl tighter. Orphanage turned us out at 18 if we hadn't found a position. I stayed on 4 extra years helping with the younger children. But funding dried up. Sisters couldn't afford to keep me. She shrugged, aiming for indifference. Mrs. Blackwood offered a solution. Promised respectable work with good families. By the time I learned what kind of work, it was too late to refuse. Family. Never knew them. Left on the orphanage steps as an infant with a note pinned to my blanket. Her name is Grace. Please care for her. That's all I have of where I came from. Monroe absorbed this quietly. We're a pair. Aren't we? No past worth claiming, no future worth hoping for. I don't believe that, Grace said firmly. We're here, aren't we? Surviving. That has to count for something. He gave her a look she couldn't quite read. When did you get to be so wise? Not wise, just stubborn. Too stubborn to give up. That why you work so hard trying to prove something? Grace considered the question. Maybe, or maybe work is easier than thinking too much. Amen to that. He shifted again, and she could see the laudanum beginning to take effect. his eyelids growing heavy. "Should sleep, both of us." This time Grace stood, but she paused by his chair. "Do you need help getting to your room?" Pride warred with practicality in his expression. "I'll manage, but thank you." She understood. Some victories had to be won alone, even small ones like making it to bed unaided. The storm raged for 3 days. They fell into an unexpected rhythm of closeness, the forced proximity breaking down walls that might have stood for years under normal circumstances. Monroe taught her card games to pass the time. Grace read aloud from one of his few books, a collection of Shakespeare that had belonged to his mother. On the second night, the chimney developed a dangerous crack from the cold. They worked together to patch it, Grace holding the boards while Monroe hammered, both of them coughing from the smoke that backed up into the room. When they finally got it sealed, they collapsed at the table, soot-covered and exhausted. And Monroe actually laughed, a rusty sound like a gate that hadn't been opened in years. "You look like a chimney sweep," he said. "You look like you've been mining coal," she shot back. They grinned at each other across the table, and something fundamental shifted between them. Not romance, that would come later, if at all, but friendship. Trust. The recognition that they were no longer stranger and employer, but two people choosing to build something together in this harsh place. On the third morning, Grace woke to silence. The storm had passed, leaving the world buried under 4 feet of snow. She found Monroe already up, standing at the window with his coffee, looking out at the transformed landscape. "Beautiful," she said, joining him. "Deadly, too," he replied, but without his usual grimness. "We'll need to dig out to the barn, check on the animals. Going to be a long day." "We'll manage," Grace said. "We always do." He glanced at her, and she caught the ghost of a smile. "Yes," he said quietly. "I suppose we do." They spent the day digging paths, tending the horses, repairing storm damage. By evening, they were exhausted, but satisfied. The ranch had weathered its first real test of winter, and so had they. That night, as Grace prepared to retire, Monroe called her back. "Grace." It was the first time he'd used her given name since that initial day. She turned, waiting. "Thank you. For the other night. For—" He struggled with words, then simply said, "For being here." "Thank you for giving me a place to be," she replied. He nodded, understanding passing between them without need for more words. Outside, the winter stars shone cold and brilliant above the snow-covered ridge. Inside, 2 broken people had found something neither had expected, not healing, perhaps, but the possibility of it. And in that harsh winter of 1878, in a cabin 15 miles from nowhere, that was enough. As Grace lay in her bed that night, she realized the walls no longer felt like a prison. Somewhere between the first snow and the last, they had become something else entirely. They had become home. The spring thaw came gradually, revealing the ranch like a photograph developing in solution. Grace stood on the porch, watching rivulets of snowmelt carve new channels in the dirt yard. 6 months she'd been here now, long enough to see the land's moods shift from dust to snow to mud. "Are you ready for this?" Monroe's voice came from behind her. She turned to find him holding the oilcloth bundle she'd seen that first night. The promise of learning to shoot, delayed by winter's grip, was finally coming due. "As ready as I'll ever be," she said. They walked to a flat area behind the barn where Monroe had set up a row of tin cans on a fallen log. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet earth and new growth. He unwrapped the gun, a Colt Navy revolver, its metal worn smooth by years of handling. "This was my service pistol," he said, checking the chambers. ".36 caliber, 6 shots. Not the newest model, but reliable. The trick is not to fight it." Grace took the weapon gingerly. It was heavier than expected, the grip cool against her palm. "First rule," Monroe said, moving behind her to adjust her stance. Never point it at anything you don't intend to destroy, even unloaded, especially unloaded. His hands guided hers, showing her how to hold it steady. Grace was acutely aware of his proximity. The first time he'd been this close since that night during the blizzard. She could smell the soap he used, feel the warmth radiating from his chest. Feet shoulder-width apart, he continued, seemingly unaffected. Weight balanced. You're not fighting the gun, you're working with it. He stepped back, and she felt oddly bereft. See that first and don't think about hitting it. Just line up the sights and squeeze, don't jerk the trigger. Smooth, like you're pressing a flower in a book. Grace aimed, trying to remember everything he'd said. The gun wavered in her grip. Breathe, Monroe said quietly. In, out. Then squeeze on the exhale. She fired. The crack split the morning air, and the gun bucked in her hand. The can remained untouched, mocking her from its perch. Not bad for a first shot, Monroe said. You stayed on the log. At least, try again. They spent the morning working through the basics, loading, aiming, firing. By the end, Grace had knocked down 3 cans and earned an approving nod from her instructor. You've got steady hands, he said, taking the gun to clean it. With practice, you'll be a fair shot. Why does it matter so much to you? Grace asked. That I learn this? Monroe was quiet for a moment, his attention seemingly focused on wiping down the cylinder. My mother never learned. Father said it wasn't proper for women. When the raiders came while he was in town, he trailed off, but Grace could fill in the rest. Samuel's wife couldn't shoot either. After Chickamauga, when I was still in the hospital, deserters ransacked their farm. She hid in the root cellar with the baby, listening to them tear apart everything they'd built. What happened to them, your sister-in-law and the child? Fever took them that winter. Maybe they'd have made it if the deserters hadn't stolen their food stores, burned the barn for spite. He looked up at her then. Every woman should know how to defend herself. The world's too hard to pretend otherwise. As they walked back to the cabin, a rider appeared on the trail. Grace tensed, but Monroe just sighed. Marshal Wade, he said. Come to check on his jurisdiction. No doubt. Marshal Josiah Wade was everything Monroe wasn't tall, straight-backed, with the kind of aggressive health that seemed almost obscene next to Monroe's careful movements. His badge gleamed in the spring sun, and his horse was the finest Grace had seen outside of picture books. Monroe, Wade said, not bothering to dismount. Miss. The last was said with a dismissive glance that made Grace's skin crawl. Marshal, Monroe replied evenly. Something we can help you with? Just making rounds. Heard you had a new arrangement here. His eyes traveled over Grace in a way that made her want to scrub herself clean. Want to make sure everything's legal and proper. Miss Sullivan is my employee, Monroe said, his voice carrying a warning edge. Nothing improper about it. Employee? Wade smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. That's what they're calling it now. Well, just remember, Monroe. We run a civilized town here. Don't want any trouble spilling over from questionable arrangements. Grace felt Monroe tense beside her, but his voice remained calm. No trouble here, Marshal. Just 2 people trying to make an honest living. Wade's gaze lingered on Grace. You need any assistance? Miss, you let me know. My office is always open to distressed ladies. I'm not distressed, Grace said quietly but firmly. Thank you for your concern. The marshal's face darkened slightly at the rejection. Well then, I'll be on my way. But Monroe, you might want to keep an eye on your stock. Cole Maddox and his boys have been seen in the area. Wouldn't want any of your animals to go missing. With that thinly veiled threat, he wheeled his horse and rode off. Pleasant fellow, Grace said once he was out of earshot. He's in the railroad's pocket, Monroe said, watching the dust settle. They want the water rights through this area. Wade's their dog, sniffing out weakness. And Maddox, Different kind of problem. We have history. He didn't elaborate, just headed inside. That afternoon, while Monroe worked on repairing winter damage to the barn, Grace walked to the small cluster of crosses on the hillside she'd noticed but never asked about. 3 markers, weathered but maintained. She knelt to read them. Asterisk Elizabeth Monroe, 1823 to 1868. Beloved mother asterisk Thomas Monroe, 1820 to 1868. Faithful husband asterisk Samuel Monroe, 1844 to 1863. Gone but not forgotten asterisk. A 4th cross stood apart, newer than the others. It bore no name, just a date asterisk May 15, 1871 asterisk. My wife? Grace startled. She hadn't heard Monroe approach, his limp almost silent on the pine needle carpet. I didn't know you'd been married. Barely 2 years. Rebecca was the school teacher in town. Thought she could save me with kindness and proper meals. He stared at the unmarked cross. Turned out I wasn't worth saving. What happened? Childbirth. Baby came too early, too hard. Doc couldn't make it through a flash flood. I tried. His hands clenched and unclenched. Some things trying isn't enough for... Grace wanted to offer comfort but didn't know how. What words could ease that kind of loss? That's why there's no name, Monroe continued. Couldn't decide if it should be hers or the baby's, so I left it blank. Cowardly, I suppose. Grief isn't cowardice, Grace said softly. He looked at her sharply, then away. Come on, chores won't do themselves. That evening, as Grace prepared supper, she heard horses approaching. Multiple horses, moving fast. Monroe grabbed his rifle, positioning himself by the window. Stay inside, he ordered. But Grace had already retrieved the Colt from where he'd stored it, checking the loads like he'd taught her. She saw his surprised look but didn't have time to explain before the riders burst into the yard. 5 men, hard-faced and dusty. The leader, Cole Maddox presumably, had the kind of handsomeness that had curdled into cruelty. His smile was all teeth and no warmth. Elijah Monroe, he called out. Been a long time. Monroe stepped onto the porch, rifle casual but ready. Not long enough, Cole? Now, that's no way to greet an old friend. We rode together once. Remember before you got religion and a badge? That was a lifetime ago. What do you want? Maddox's eyes found Grace through the window. Well, heard you had yourself a woman up here. Didn't believe it. What with your limitations? He emphasized the last word like a blade. Seems you're not as broken as you look. State your business or move on. Cole. Missing some cattle. Trail led this direction. Thought maybe they wandered onto your land. No strays here, Monroe said evenly. Check the canyon lands north. Stock gets confused in the draws sometimes. Maybe we should have a look ourselves, one of Maddox's men suggested. Make sure you're not hiding our property. You're welcome to try, Monroe replied, and something in his voice made Grace shiver. This was the gunslinger Maddox had spoken of, the man who'd lived by violence before choosing another way. The tension stretched taut before Maddox laughed. No need for unpleasantness. We're all civilized men here. His gaze found Grace again. Ma'am, if you ever tire of damaged goods, you let me know. I pay well for companionship. Grace stepped onto the porch, the Colt visible in her hand. Mr. Monroe pays me fairly for honest work. I have no interest in other arrangements. Maddox's eyes narrowed at the sight of the gun. Monroe, you teaching your woman to shoot? That's dangerous thinking. Miss Sullivan has the right to protect herself, Monroe said, from rustlers and other vermin. The insult landed. Maddox's hand twitched toward his gun, but Monroe's rifle shifted slightly, and the moment passed. We'll be going, Maddox said. But Monroe, you might want to reconsider your position here. This mountain's getting crowded. Accidents happen to stubborn men. And they're women. They rode off in a cloud of dust and threats. Grace realized she was shaking. The Colt suddenly heavy in her grip. "You did well," Monroe said quietly, taking the gun from her trembling hands. "But Maddox doesn't make idle threats. This is going to get worse before it gets better." "Who is he to you, really?" Monroe was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. "Finally, we rode together after the war, both of us angry, lost, looking for targets that deserved what we'd learned to do. But where I eventually found my way out, Cole found he liked the taste of other people's fear. We parted ways when he started hitting banks instead of just rustlers. And now he wants your land. He wants the water, same as the railroad. This ranch sits on the best year-round spring for 50 miles. He looked tired suddenly, older. Sometimes I think I should just let them have it, find somewhere else to fail." "No," Grace said firmly. "This is your home. Your family's buried here. That means something." He studied her face. "When did you start caring so much about this place?" Grace thought about it. When had the ranch stopped being a prison and become something worth protecting? Maybe when I realized it was the first place I've ever been allowed to just be, not the orphan girl, not the charity case, not the purchased woman, just Grace. Something shifted in Monroe's expression. "Grace," he said, like he was testing the weight of her name. "We should work on your aim. If trouble's coming, you'll need to shoot better than you did this morning." The next weeks passed in preparation. Monroe drilled her relentlessly, not just shooting, but tactics, movement, how to think under pressure. The neighbors began to whisper more openly about the bought woman learning to handle firearms. Some were scandalized. Others, like the widow Tess Carter who ran the boarding house in town, seemed quietly approving. "About time someone taught women to defend themselves," Tess said when Grace accompanied Monroe to town for supplies. "Too many of us learned too late that depending on men's protection is a fool's game." Doc Everett, ancient and blunt, was less encouraging. "You're playing with fire, Monroe," he said during one of his visits to check on Monroe's leg. "Wade's looking for an excuse, and Maddox is worse. You can't protect her from both." "I can teach her to protect herself," Monroe replied stubbornly. "And when they come in force, what then, you going to gun them all down from your porch?" The doctor shook his head. "You're not that man anymore. Elijah. Haven't been for years. Don't let pride make you forget it." But Grace could see the old gunslinger stirring in Monroe as the threats mounted, the way his hand never strayed far from iron, the cold calculation in his eyes when he watched the horizon. He was preparing for war, and she was both grateful and terrified. One evening, as they cleaned guns together, a strangely domestic ritual, Grace asked, "Do you regret teaching me?" "No," he said without hesitation. "Whatever happens, you'll face it with steel in your hand instead of prayers on your lips. That's all any of us can ask for." "And if I have to use it, if I have to kill—" Monroe's hands stilled on the rifle he was cleaning. "Then you'll carry that weight forever, but you'll be alive to carry it." He looked at her directly. "That's the trade. Grace, your innocence for your life. I won't pretend it's fair or easy, but it's better than the alternative." Grace nodded, understanding. The West didn't care about fair. It cared about who was left standing when the smoke cleared. And increasingly, she was determined that would be them, her and this broken man who'd given her more respect and freedom than the whole civilized world combined. The gun was clean and loaded when she set it aside. Tomorrow, Monroe had promised to teach her to shoot from horseback. Another skill for survival. Another step away from the helpless girl who'd arrived in a trader's wagon. She was no longer that girl. The mountain had changed her. Monroe had changed her. And most surprisingly, she had changed herself. Whatever came next, Wade's legal threats, Maddox's violence, or challenges she couldn't yet imagine, she would meet it standing. The Colt Navy sat on the table between them, lamplight playing off its worn metal. A tool, a promise, a possibility. Grace Sullivan was learning to shoot, and in the unforgiving mathematics of the frontier, that might just be enough. The smell of smoke woke Grace from dead sleep. For a moment, she lay frozen, thinking it was a nightmare, but the acrid scent grew stronger, and through her window she could see an orange glow painting the night sky. "Fire!" Monroe's voice cut through the walls. The hay barn. Grace threw on her boots and coat, grabbing the water bucket from beside her washstand. By the time she reached the yard, Monroe was already limping toward the burning structure, flames licking up its wooden sides like hungry tongues. "The horses!" he shouted over the roar. "Dancers in there!" Without thinking, Grace dropped her bucket and ran for the barn. The heat hit her like a physical wall, but she could hear the young paint horse screaming in terror. Monroe was right behind her, moving faster than she'd ever seen despite his bad leg. Inside was chaos smoke thick as wool, sparks raining down like fireflies from hell. Dancer reared and plunged in his stall, eyes rolling white with panic. Grace fumbled with the latch while Monroe threw a wet blanket over the horse's head. "Easy, boy, easy," he crooned, his voice somehow steady despite the inferno around them. "Grace, when I get him calm, you lead him out, fast and straight. Don't stop for anything." The moment Dancer's hooves touched ground, Grace grabbed his halter and ran. The horse nearly dragged her off her feet, but she held on, bursting through the barn doors into blessed cool air. Behind them, a beam crashed down where they'd been standing seconds before. Monroe emerged coughing, soot-blackened and limping worse than usual. "The water barrels," he gasped. "We can save the structure." They worked through the night, a desperate rhythm of bucket chains and beating at flames with wet blankets. Grace's hands blistered and her lungs burned, but she didn't stop. Neighbors appeared as if from nowhere, the Garrett family from 2 miles east, old Tom Sullivan from the valley. Even in their isolated corner of the world, fire brought people together. By dawn, they'd saved most of the barn's frame, though the roof was gone and one wall had collapsed. Grace sat in the dirt, too exhausted to stand, surveying the damage. Monroe lowered himself beside her, grimacing as his leg protested. "Could have been worse," he said quietly. Grace noticed something glinting in the ashes near the barn's foundation. She crawled over, brushing away debris to reveal the remains of a kerosene lantern, one they never used in the hay barn because of the fire risk. "Elijah!" she called, her voice hoarse. "Look at this!" His face darkened as he examined the evidence. Near the lantern's remains, boot prints marked the soft ground prints that didn't match any of their shoes. "Maddox," he said, the name like a curse. Tom Sullivan crouched beside them, studying the tracks with a frontiersman's eye. "These are fresh, maybe 6 hours old. And look here," he pointed to marks in the dirt. "Rope burns. They hobbled their horses back in the trees, came in on foot." "We should tell Marshal Wade," Grace said, though even as she spoke, she knew how hollow it sounded. "Tell him what?" Monroe's voice was bitter. "That we found tracks a broken lantern. Wade would say we can't prove anything. That it could have been anyone, or worse, that we set it ourselves for insurance money." He was right, and they all knew it. The law in San Gabriel belonged to whoever paid best. And right now, that was the railroad interests who wanted Monroe's water rights. As the neighbors dispersed with promises to help rebuild, a new rider approached. Grace recognized the tall figure of Samuel Hartley, chief surveyor for the Mountain Pacific Railroad Company. Unlike Wade's aggressive presence or Maddox's naked threat, Hartley carried himself with the quiet confidence of institutional power. "Mr. Monroe, Miss Sullivan," he touched his hat politely. "I heard about your misfortune. Terrible thing. Barn fires. So much can be lost so quickly." "State your business." "Hartley," Monroe said wearily. The surveyor produced a leather portfolio from his saddlebag. "Actually, I come bearing what might be good news. The railroad is prepared to make you a very generous offer for your water rights. Not the whole ranch. Mind you, just permission to run a spur line through to access the spring. You could keep your home, even expand operations with the money we're offering. He named a figure that made Grace's eyes widen. It was more money than she'd imagined existing in one place. That's double your last offer, Monroe observed. The board is eager to move forward with expansion. Your spring is critical to our plans for a new depot and cattle loading facility. Hartley's smile was practiced. With that kind of money, you could rebuild your barn properly. Maybe even hire some hands for protection against unfortunate accidents. The threat was velvet-wrapped but unmistakable. Grace felt Monroe tense beside her. And if I refuse, well, the railroad has ways of acquiring what it needs. Eminent domain proceedings can be complicated, expensive, and during such legal processes, who knows what misfortunes might befall a small ranch. Hartley glanced meaningfully at the smoldering barn. I'd hate to see you lose everything fighting the inevitable. Get off my land, Monroe said quietly. Think about it, Mr. Monroe. My offer stands until the end of the week. Hartley tipped his hat again. Good day to you both. As his dust settled, Grace found her voice. That's a lot of money, Elijah. It's a death sentence, he replied. Once they have the water, they'll squeeze out every small rancher in the valley, turn the whole region into company land, company towns, company stores. I've seen it happen. That evening, as they shared a simple meal in the shadow of the burned barn, Monroe seemed to come to a decision. I need to ride to Cedar Falls tomorrow. There's a lawyer there who might help Jonathan Winters. We served together. He'll at least give me an honest assessment of our legal options. I'll come with you, Grace said immediately. No, it's a 2-day ride, and someone needs to watch the ranch. Can you handle things here? Grace nodded, though the thought of being alone made her uneasy. What if Maddox comes back? Monroe pushed back from the table and retrieved something from his room, a second revolver. This one, a newer model, Colt. This was Rebecca's, he said quietly. She never learned to use it, but it's in good condition. Keep it loaded, keep it close. That night, Grace helped him prepare for the journey, packing provisions and checking his saddle. There was an intimacy to the preparations, a domestic rhythm that felt both natural and charged with unspoken possibility. Grace, Monroe said as she handed him his packed saddlebags. If something happens while I'm gone. Nothing will happen, she interrupted. If it does, he continued firmly. There's money hidden under a loose board beneath my bed, enough to get you to California or anywhere else you want to go. Don't try to hold this place alone. It's not worth your life. Is it worth yours? She challenged. He looked at her for a long moment. It used to be all I had. Now, he stopped, shaking his head. Just be careful. He left at first light. Grace watched until horse and rider disappeared into the pine shadows, then turned to face the ranch alone. The burned barn looked skeletal in the morning sun, a reminder of how quickly things could be destroyed. She threw herself into work clearing debris, tending the horses, maintaining the fiction of normalcy. But as afternoon wore on, she found herself checking the horizon constantly, the loaded Colt a new weight on her hip. Tess Carter arrived near sunset with a basket of food and welcome company. Thought you might appreciate a proper meal, the older woman said, though her sharp eyes took in the burned barn and Grace's armed state. Heard Elijah rode out this morning. Business in Cedar Falls, Grace said carefully. Tess unpacked fresh bread and a pot of stew. Also heard Samuel Hartley was sniffing around. Railroad getting pushy. Grace nodded, grateful for someone who understood without explanation. As they ate, Tess shared news from town. Wade had arrested 2 drifters for drunk and disorderly. The Maddox gang had been seen heading south, presumably to hassle other ranchers. You know, Tess said casually, I've got an empty room at the boarding house. You'd be welcome until Elijah returns. I can't leave the ranch unguarded. Pride's a cold bedfellow. Girl, colder still if you're dead. But Grace shook her head. This is my home now. I won't be run off by fear. Tess studied her with something like approval. "You've grown a spine since you arrived. Good. You'll need it." She gathered her things to leave before full dark. "I'll send my boy Jimmy up tomorrow to check on you. Don't shoot him by accident." Alone again. Grace barred the door and checked her weapons. The night sounds seemed louder without Monroe's presence. Every crack of settling wood made her heart race. She dozed fitfully in a chair by the window, starting awake at each coyote howl. The second night was worse. No visitors came during the day, leaving Grace to wrestle with isolation and growing paranoia. She found herself talking to the horses just to hear a voice, even her own. As darkness fell, she was considering taking Tess up on her offer when she heard horses approaching, moving slow and quiet. Grace doused the lamp and positioned herself by the window, both revolvers within reach. Moonlight revealed 3 riders pausing at the property edge. Her heart sank as she recognized Cole Maddox's distinctive silhouette. They dismounted and spread out, clearly planning to surround the cabin. Grace's hands shook as she checked the loads in both guns. 3 men, experienced killers all, against 1 woman who'd been shooting for mere months. The mathematics were brutal. Then, impossibly, she heard more horses coming fast from the opposite direction. The Maddox gang heard them too, freezing in uncertainty. A voice rang out. "Grace Sullivan. It's Doc Everett with the Garrett boys. Monroe sent us to check on you." The old doctor's timing was miraculous. Faced with witnesses, Maddox's men melted back into the shadows. Grace heard them riding off as Doc and 2 of the neighboring ranchers' sons reached the cabin. "Sorry we're late," Doc said, reading the situation with one glance at Grace's pale face and ready weapons. "Elijah sent a telegram from Cedar Falls. Seemed to think you might have uninvited company." "You could say that," Grace managed, her legs suddenly weak with relief. Young Tom Garrett whistled low. "Looks like we missed a party. Want us to stay the night?" Miss Sullivan. Grace's pride warred with practicality. "I'd be grateful," she admitted. They took turns standing watch. Though Grace couldn't sleep, she sat by the fire, cleaning the revolvers obsessively, thinking about Monroe somewhere on the trail. He'd known she might need help, had arranged protection even from a distance. The care in that gesture made her chest tight with an emotion she wasn't ready to name. Dawn brought Monroe himself, riding hard despite his legs' protests. Grace was checking the chicken coop when she saw him coming, and relief flooded through her so strongly she had to grip the fence post for support. He swung down from the saddle, eyes searching her face. "You're all right." "Thanks to your foresight, Maddox came calling?" But Doc's arrival discouraged him. Something fierce flashed in Monroe's eyes. "I'll deal with Cole." "No." Grace surprised herself with the firmness of her refusal. "No more dealing. No more reacting. What did the lawyer say?" Monroe's expression grew grim. "That we have a case, but it'll be expensive and slow. The railroad has deep pockets and patience, but there might be another way. Winters knows a federal marshal in Denver, a real one. Not Wade's type. If we can prove Maddox is working for the railroad, intimidating landowners." "Can we prove it?" "Maybe. Winters is investigating. In the meantime..." He looked at the burned barn, jaw tight. "In the meantime, we rebuild and hold on." That afternoon, as they worked side by side clearing more debris, Grace felt something shifting between them. The careful distance Monroe had maintained was eroding, worn away by shared danger and mutual dependence. When their hands brushed passing tools, neither pulled away quite as quickly as before. "I was worried," Monroe admitted suddenly, not looking at her. "On the trail, knowing you were here alone. I almost turned back twice." "But you didn't." "No, because I knew you could handle it. You're not the frightened girl who arrived in that wagon anymore. Grace." "And you're not the broken man who bought her," Grace replied softly. He did look at her then, something raw and hungry in his expression before he shuddered it away. "We should finish before dark. Rain's coming. But Grace had seen that look, and it answered questions she'd been afraid to ask. Whatever was growing between them, Monroe felt it too. The knowledge was thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. As the first drops began to fall, they hurried to cover the salvageable lumber. Working together in the gathering storm, Grace realized that somewhere between the fire and the fear, between teaching and learning, they'd become partners in truth. Not employer and employee, not man and purchased woman, but two people choosing to build something worth defending. The rain came harder, and they ran for the cabin, laughing despite everything. At the door, Monroe caught her arm. "Grace, I need you to know what I said about the money. About running if things go bad. I meant it. This place, this fight, it's not worth your life." "What about your life?" she asked, rain streaming down her face. "That's different." "No," she said firmly. "It's not anymore." She went inside before he could respond, but she felt his eyes on her back, felt the weight of words unspoken hanging between them like the storm clouds overhead. The battle for the ranch was far from over, but Grace Sullivan was no longer fighting alone. And that, she thought as thunder shook the cabin walls, made all the difference. The spring rain fell soft as whispers against the cabin windows, filling the air with the scent of wet pine and new earth. Grace arranged wildflowers in an old mason jar, Indian paintbrush, blue columbine, and prairie roses she'd found blooming in a sheltered valley. The simple act of bringing beauty inside felt like defiance against all the ugliness pressing in from outside. Monroe sat at the table, ostensibly mending harness leather but watching her more than his work. She'd grown aware of his gaze lately, feeling it like warmth on her skin whenever they shared the same room. 9 months she'd been here now, and the careful boundaries they'd maintained were wearing thin as morning mist. "Those are nice," he said quietly, nodding at the flowers. "My mother loved wildflowers." The words slipped out before Grace realized she'd spoken them. She froze, jar still in hand. "You remember her?" "No, I don't know why I said that." She set the jar on the table, troubled. "Sometimes I have these fragments, like dreams, but different. A woman humming while she arranges flowers, the scent of lavender soap. But the sisters said I was left as an infant." Monroe's hands had stilled on the leather. "Maybe you were older than they thought. Memory's a strange thing." Grace touched one of the delicate petals. "It doesn't matter. I suppose she gave me away. That's all that really counts." "Is it?" His voice carried an edge she didn't recognize. "Maybe she didn't have a choice. Maybe giving you up was the only way to save you." "From what?" "From a world that's cruel to women without protection. From poverty or worse." He set aside the harness, agitation clear in his movements. "You think I don't know what people say, that I bought you like livestock? But what was the alternative? Leave you to Blackwood's other clients, men who wouldn't have given you a separate room or taught you to defend yourself." Grace stared at him, startled by his vehemence. "Elijah." "I've watched you these months," he continued, standing abruptly. "Seen you grow strong, confident. Seen you become who you were meant to be instead of what the world tried to make you, and I tell myself it justifies everything, that I saved you. But the truth is—" He stopped, jaw clenched. "The truth is what?" Grace asked softly. He turned to face her fully, and the raw honesty in his expression made her heart stutter. "The truth is, I'm a selfish man. I told myself I needed help with the ranch, but I could have hired any of a dozen locals. I chose you because—" He took a step closer. "Because the moment I saw you in that wagon, proud despite everything, I forgot how to breathe." The rain intensified, drumming against the roof. Thunder rolled distant across the mountains. Grace found herself moving toward him without conscious thought. "I tried to keep distance between us," Monroe continued, his voice rough. "Tried to be honorable. But every day gets harder. Every time you smile, Every time you stand up to men like Maddox or Wade, every time you just exist in the same space as me, I come a little more undone." They stood barely a foot apart now. Grace could see the pulse beating fast at his throat, could smell the leather and soap scent of him. "I know what I am," he said. "A broken-down gunfighter with blood on his hands and too many ghosts. I know what you must think." "You don't know what I think," Grace interrupted. "You've never asked." His eyes searched hers. "Then tell me." Grace took a breath, gathering courage she didn't know she possessed. "I think you're the first person who ever saw me as more than what I could provide, whether that was labor at the orphanage or other things for men like Blackwood's clients. You gave me choices when I'd never had any. You taught me to defend myself when you could have kept me helpless." She raised her hand to his face, feeling him tremble at the touch. "You're not broken, Elijah. You're healing. We both are." "Grace." Her name was prayer and plea combined. "I can't offer you anything. No proper marriage. No standing in town. No—" "I don't want what you can offer," she said. "I want what you can." "And what's that?" "You," she said simply. "Just you." The last wall between them crumbled. Monroe pulled her against him, burying his face in her hair. She felt the shudder run through him, felt years of loneliness and self-punishment crack like ice in spring. "I don't want obedience. Grace," he said, the words muffled against her neck. "I don't want a woman bought for silver. I want you. Just you as you are, fierce and free in choosing to be here. But only if it's truly your choice." Grace pulled back enough to meet his eyes. "Do you think I would have stayed through winter storms and barn fires and death threats if I didn't choose to? Do you think I'm here out of obligation?" "Why are you here?" The question seemed torn from him. "Because somewhere between that first shooting lesson and watching you rebuild after the fire, I fell in love with you." The admission hung between them like lightning before thunder. "Because this cabin is the first place that's ever felt like home. Because when I think about leaving, I can't breathe." Monroe made a sound that might have been her name, or might have been wordless surrender. Then his mouth found hers, and the world contracted to just this: the press of lips, the tangle of hands in hair, the sweet ache of barriers finally falling. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Monroe rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said, the words rusty but certain. "God help me. I've loved you since you stood in my yard, soaked with rain, and looked at me like I was a puzzle to solve instead of a monster to fear." Grace laughed, surprising them both. "We're quite a pair, aren't we, the purchased woman and the gunfighter?" "No," Monroe said firmly. "Just Grace and Elijah. Everything else is the past." They stood holding each other as the storm passed over, leaving the world washed clean. The jar of wildflowers caught the lamplight, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Grace thought of all the careful distances they'd maintained, all the proper boundaries, and found she mourned none of them. "What happens now?" she asked. Monroe's hand cupped her cheek. Now we stop pretending we're just employer and employee. Now we face whatever comes as what we really are." "Which is—" "Partners," he said, "in every sense." Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she held his gaze. "I'll come to you," she said quietly, "when it's my choice, when I'm ready. Not because I was bought or because I owe you, but because I want to." "I'll wait," Monroe said simply. "Forever if needed." But Grace knew it wouldn't be forever. The wall between their rooms that had seemed so solid now felt thin as paper. The careful courtesies they'd maintained, the formal Miss Sullivan, the respectful distances, all of it had been armor against this moment. Now, with the armor cast aside, everything felt raw and new and precious. They spent the evening in a haze of new intimacy. Simple things, preparing dinner, tending the fire, became charged with meaning. When their hands brushed, they lingered. When they sat by the hearth, Grace curled against Monroe's side, his arm around her like it had always belonged there. "I should tell you something," Monroe said as the fire burned low. "About Maddox, about our history." "You don't have to." "Yes, I do. No more secrets between us." He stared into the flames. "After the war, I was lost, angry, my leg hurt constantly. My brother was dead. Everything I'd believed in seemed like a lie. I fell in with men who felt the same. We told ourselves we were fighting the companies and carpetbaggers exploiting the South. But really, we were just outlaws." Grace said nothing, just pressed closer to his side. "Maddox and I were partners. We hit banks, payroll wagons, anything that belonged to Northern interests. I told myself it was justice, but it was just revenge. Then one day we robbed a train carrying more than money." His voice went hollow. "There was a family in the passenger car, settlers heading west. When the father tried to protect his wife and daughter, Maddox shot him. The woman screamed, and he shot her too. Would have killed the girl if I hadn't stopped him." "How old was she?" "Maybe 12. Same age Samuel was when he started following me everywhere." Monroe's jaw tightened. "I got her out, found a family to take her in, but that was the end for me and Cole. He called me weak, said I'd gone soft. Maybe he was right. All I know is I looked at that girl's face and saw every innocent person who'd suffered because of men like us." "You saved her," Grace pointed out, "after helping create the situation that orphaned her." He shook his head. "That's the man you say you love. Grace, a killer who found his conscience too late." Grace was quiet for a long moment. Then, "The man I love is the one who gave a desperate woman dignity and choice, who teaches patience to horses and shoots mercy to injured creatures, who carries the weight of his past without letting it crush him." She touched his face, making him meet her eyes. "We are not our worst moments, Elijah. We are what we choose to be after." He caught her hand, pressing it to his lips. "How did you get so wise?" "I had a good teacher," she said, and was rewarded with one of his rare, real smiles. Later, as the night grew deep, they reluctantly parted. At her door, Monroe caught her hand. "Grace, earlier, when you talked about your mother, have you had those fragments before?" "Sometimes, little things, the smell of bread baking, a man's voice singing, but the sisters said my imagination was overactive. Maybe, or maybe there's more to your story than they told you." He squeezed her hand gently. "We could write to them, ask questions." The possibility both thrilled and terrified her. After all this time, what would be the point? The point would be knowing, good or bad. Truth is better than wondering. Grace considered this. After, she decided, after we deal with Maddox and the railroad, one battle at a time. After, Monroe agreed. They lingered in the doorway, neither wanting to break this new, precious connection. Finally, Grace rose on her toes and kissed him softly. "Good night, Elijah." "Good night, Grace." She closed the door but stood with her hand pressed to the wood, feeling his presence on the other side. Everything had changed tonight. The careful dance they'd been doing for months had ended, replaced by something deeper and more dangerous. Love made them vulnerable in ways guns and threats never could. But it also made them stronger. Grace thought of the battles ahead, Maddox's violence, the railroad's greed, Wade's corruption. Before, she'd been fighting for survival and a place to belong. Now she was fighting for a future, for the possibility of building something lasting with the man on the other side of the door. Through her window, she could see stars emerging as the storm clouds parted. The wildflowers in their jar caught the moonlight, delicate but resilient, like hope. Grace thought, like love itself, fragile seeming but strong enough to grow in the harshest ground. She prepared for bed, aware of every sound from Monroe's room, the scrape of his chair, the uneven rhythm of his steps, the creak of his bed frame. Such ordinary sounds, but weighted now with new meaning. She thought of her promise, "I'll come to you when I'm ready," and knew that moment was approaching like dawn after a long night. But not tonight. Tonight was for absorbing the wonder of being loved, of loving in return. Tonight was for imagining a future where she and Elijah faced the world not as employer and employee, not as two damaged souls seeking shelter, but as partners who had chosen each other despite everything. Grace lay in her narrow bed, listening to the night sounds of the ranch. Somewhere an owl called. The horses shifted in their stalls. The house settled around them like protective arms. And in the next room, the man she loved kept his own vigil, waiting as he'd promised to wait until she came to him not from obligation or purchase price, but from her own free will. The thought made her smile in the darkness. After a lifetime of having choices made for her, the power to choose felt like the greatest gift Elijah had given her, greater than the shooting lessons, greater than the separate room, greater even than his love. He'd given her agency over her own life, and now, at last, she knew exactly what she wanted to do with it. The ambush came at Devil's Cut, where the trail narrowed between two walls of red rock. Grace heard the rifle crack before she saw the muzzle flash. Then Monroe's horse was screaming and going down. She kicked free of her own stirrups as chaos erupted around them. "Ridge left," Monroe shouted, already rolling for cover despite his bad leg. Grace dove behind a boulder as bullets whined overhead, chips of stone stinging her face. Her heart hammered as she counted muzzle flashes 5, maybe 6 shooters positioned on both sides of the canyon. They'd ridden straight into Maddox's trap. Monroe had found shelter behind his fallen horse, returning fire with cold precision, even pinned down and outnumbered. He moved with the economy of a man who'd survived worse odds, but Grace could see blood on his sleeve where a bullet had grazed him, and their position was untenable. "Can you reach the Winchester?" he called to her. The rifle was still in her saddle scabbard, her horse dancing nervously 20 feet away. 20 feet that might as well be 20 miles with bullets filling the air between. "Cover me," Grace said, not giving herself time to think. Grace, no. But she was already moving, staying low and using every scrap of cover. Monroe's guns roared, forcing the ambushers to duck. She reached her horse, grabbed the rifle, and was diving back when she felt the bullet tug at her skirt. Then she was behind the boulder again, breathing hard, but intact. "Damn it, woman," Monroe said, but there was pride mixed with the fear in his voice. Grace checked the Winchester's load, forcing her hands steady. "Where's Maddox?" "Haven't seen him. This might just be—" Monroe broke off to fire at movement above. "Might just be his boys earning their keep." They were low on ammunition and lower on options. The ambushers had chosen their spot well, no way forward. No way back without crossing open ground. Grace's mind raced, remembering something Monroe had taught her about fighting when outnumbered. "The rocks," she said. "Above them on the left. If we can bring those down." Monroe followed her gaze to where recent rains had loosened a section of the cliff face. A precise shot to the right spot might trigger a slide. It was desperate, but desperate was all they had. "I'll draw their fire," he said immediately. "You take the shot." Your arm." "I've shot with worse, on 3. Grace positioned herself, sighting carefully on the fractured stone. Monroe counted down, then burst from cover, firing rapidly with both pistols. The ambushers responded predictably, focusing on the moving threat. Grace breathed out slowly and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then came a crack like thunder as tons of rock began to move. The 2 shooters on the left ridge had just enough time to scream before the slide swept them away. "Move!" Monroe was beside her, pulling her up. They ran for better positions as the remaining ambushers, rattled by their losses, fired wild. They took shelter behind a wider formation, Monroe grimacing as he reloaded. Grace saw his sleeve was soaked with blood now, the graze worse than he'd let on. "Let me see," she demanded. Later. We need... The sentence died as Cole Maddox himself appeared on the trail ahead, flanked by 2 more men. He sat his horse easily, guns holstered, wearing the confident smile of a man who held all the cards. Well, Monroe, you always did like them feisty. His eyes traveled over Grace in a way that made her skin crawl. Have to admit, she's got sand. Shame to waste her on a broken-down cripple. Let her go. Cole, Monroe said, stepping partially in front of Grace. This is between us. No. Maddox's smile widened. See, that's where you're wrong. The railroad wants you gone, and they're paying well to make it happen. But your woman there, she's what we call a bonus. The boys get lonely out on the trail. Grace felt Monroe go rigid beside her. When he spoke, his voice carried an edge she'd never heard before the cold killer he'd once been breaking through. Touch her and I'll hunt down every last one of you. Won't be badges or trials. Just blood. Maddox laughed. Big talk from a man bleeding out behind a rock. Tell you what, though, I'm feeling sporting. Your lady wants to play with guns. Let's see how good Monroe's lessons really were. He drew and fired in one smooth motion, not at them, but at a tin cup hanging from his saddle horn 50 feet away. It spun off into the dust. Your turn, sweetheart. You hit that rock there. He pointed to a fist-sized stone balanced on a boulder. And I'll let you both ride out, miss, and... Well, don't, Monroe said quietly. It's a trick. I'll take the shot, Grace said, stepping clear of cover. The remaining ambushers had emerged from their positions, forming a loose circle. 7 men total, all armed, all watching her with expressions ranging from amusement to hunger. Grace had never felt more exposed. She raised the Winchester, acutely aware of every eye on her. The stone target seemed impossibly small, wavering in the heat shimmer. Her hands wanted to shake, but she remembered Monroe's lessons. Breathe. Steady. Don't think about the consequences, just the shot. Pressure's different when it counts, isn't it? Maddox taunted. When missing means... Grace fired. The stone exploded into fragments. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Maddox's face darkened with fury. Lucky shot. But a deal's a deal, I suppose. Mount up and... No. Grace worked the Winchester's lever, keeping it leveled. Our turn to make a deal. You and your men leave. Now. Don't come back. In exchange, I don't put the next bullet between your eyes. Maddox's hand twitched toward his gun. You think you're faster than me, girl. I don't need to be faster, Grace said calmly. Just accurate. And we've established I'm very accurate. 7 guns against 2? Well, 1.5. He sneered at Monroe's bloody arm. You can't take us all. No, Monroe agreed, his own weapons now drawn. But we can take you. Cole, you'll die first. Your boys might get us after, but you'll be too dead to enjoy it. That worth the railroad's money. The standoff stretched taut. Grace kept her breathing steady, the rifle's weight familiar in her hands. She thought of all the tin cans she'd shot, all the hours of practice, leading to this moment. One shot. She could make it. She knew she could. Whether Maddox saw that certainty in her eyes or simply calculated the odds. He slowly raised his hands away from his guns. Mount up, boys, he said, not taking his eyes off Grace. Seems the lady's made her point. Cole, one of his men protested. The railroad. We'll have to pay extra for us to come back with more men. Maddox's smile returned, cold as winter moon. This isn't over. Monroe, you or your woman show your faces in town. You're fair game. And that federal marshal your lawyer friend's been writing to accidents happen on long rides from Denver. They rode off in a cloud of dust and threats. Grace didn't lower the Winchester until they were specks in the distance. Only then did her hands begin to shake. You did it, Monroe said wonderingly. Grace, that was... His words cut off as his knees buckled. Grace barely caught him before he hit the ground, the Winchester clattering away. Up close, she could see he'd been hiding more than the arm wound. Blood seeped through his shirt low on his left side. "Just a graze," he mumbled. "Had worse." "Stop talking," Grace ordered, her voice sharp with fear. She tore strips from her petticoat, packing the wounds as best she could. His horse was dead, but hers had stayed close despite the gunfire. "Can you ride?" "Have to, don't I?" He gripped her shoulder, levering himself up. "Though you might have to tie me to the saddle." The ride back to the ranch was a nightmare. Monroe swayed dangerously, kept upright only by Grace's arm around him and sheer stubborn will. Blood seeped through the makeshift bandages, leaving a trail any tracker could follow. But they made it. Monroe semi-conscious but still in the saddle when they reached the cabin. Grace got him inside and onto the bed, then flew into action. Water boiling, bandages torn, the medical supplies Monroe kept for horse injuries pressed into human service. The bullet had passed through the flesh of his side, painful and bloody, but not immediately fatal if kept clean. The arm was simpler, just a deep furrow that would scar but heal clean. She worked with steady hands, all her fear channeled into action. "Grace!" Monroe caught her wrist as she finished wrapping the wounds. "The gun? When you made that shot, face them down?" He struggled for words. "I've never seen anything like it." "I had a good teacher," she said, trying for lightness. "No." His grip tightened. "That was all your courage, your choice. You saved us." "We saved each other," Grace corrected. "That's what partners do." She stayed beside him through the night, monitoring his breathing, checking for fever. When he woke near dawn, she was dozing in the chair beside the bed. He reached out, brushing her cheek, and she startled awake. "How do you feel?" she asked immediately. "Like I've been shot," he said dryly. "But I'll live. Grace, what Maddox said about showing our faces in town, he meant it. We're trapped here unless we can prove he's working for the railroad." "Then we prove it," Grace said firmly. "Your lawyer friend, the federal marshal. Could be weeks before they arrive. If they arrive." Monroe tried to sit up, winced, and fell back. "We need evidence now. Documents, witnesses, something solid." Grace thought of Marshal Wade, his oily deference to railroad money. "What about Wade's office if he's taking bribes? There might be records." "Breaking into a marshal's office," Monroe almost smiled. "That's a hanging offense." "So is what they're doing to us." Grace met his eyes steadily. "I won't sit here waiting for them to come back with more men. We fight or we run, and I'm tired of running from things I didn't choose." Monroe studied her face, seeing the determination there. "You've changed," he said quietly. "The girl who arrived in that wagon would never have suggested breaking the law." "That girl didn't have anything worth fighting for." Grace took his hand, careful of his injuries. "Now I do." The next day, while Monroe recovered, unexpected allies arrived. Tess Carter brought Doc Everett and 3 other townspeople, the baker Tom Garrett, the blacksmith Jonas Wright, and, surprisingly, the banker's wife, Mrs. Adelaide Morrison. "Heard about the ambush," Tess said without preamble. "Also heard how your Grace faced down 7 armed men with a rifle and steady nerves." "News travels," Monroe said from his bed, where Grace had insisted he stay. "So does inspiration." "Mrs." Morrison spoke up, her cultured voice at odds with the steel in her eyes. "I've lived in this town 20 years, watching it slide into the railroad's pocket, watching good people driven out or bought off. But seeing what Miss Sullivan did, a woman standing up to those thugs, well, it's time someone else showed similar courage." Doc Everett cleared his throat. "What Adelaide's trying to say is, you're not alone anymore. Some of us are tired of pretending Wade represents justice or that Maddox is anything but a hired killer." "I can get you into Wade's office," Jonas Wright said quietly. The big blacksmith had barely spoken 10 words to Grace in all her trips to town, but now his face was set with determination. "I shoe his horses, maintain his locks, Have a key for emergencies. That's, Monroe began. Necessary. Tess interrupted. The railroad's called a town meeting for tomorrow night. Hartley's going to propose a civic partnership that basically hands them control of everything. Wade will speak in favor. Of course, unless we have something concrete to show people. Grace felt a spark of hope. When would be the best time? During the meeting, Mrs. Morrison said. Everyone will be at the town hall, including Wade. His office will be empty. They planned quickly. Aware that time was short, Jonas would provide the key and stand watch. Grace would search the office while Monroe, despite his protests about his injuries, would be ready with horses for a quick escape if needed. Why? Grace asked Mrs. Morrison before they left. Why risk your position for us? The banker's wife smiled thinly. Because my husband takes railroad money to foreclose on families like yours. Because I have a daughter, and I want her to grow up in a world where women can be more than decorations or property. Because what you did yesterday, standing up to those men, reminded me that courage is contagious. After they left, Monroe pulled Grace close with his good arm. This is dangerous. If we're caught, then we'll face it together, Grace said simply. No more running. Remember? That night, as she helped change his bandages, Monroe caught her hand. Grace, if something happens tomorrow. Nothing will happen. If it does, he persisted. I need you to know these months with you have been worth everything. All the pain, all the struggle. You gave me a reason to stop merely existing and start living again. Grace kissed him softly, tasting the truth of his words. You gave me the same gift. Now stop talking like we're going to die tomorrow. Just being realistic. Be optimistic instead. Think about what we'll build when this is over, when the ranch is safe and Maddox is gone. What do you want to build? Monroe asked, genuinely curious. Grace considered. A real home. Maybe expand the vegetable garden. Teach other women to shoot. Tess mentioned several who were interested after hearing about yesterday. Raise horses. She paused, then added quietly, maybe raise children. Someday. Monroe's breath caught. Children. If you want. She felt suddenly shy. I mean, we've never talked about... Yes, he said fiercely. Yes, to all of it. Garden, horses, children, whatever future you can imagine. I want it all, as long as it's with you. They held each other carefully, mindful of his wounds but needing the connection. Tomorrow would bring danger and possibly disaster, but tonight they had each other in the dream of a life beyond mere survival. Grace thought of the woman she'd been 10 months ago, frightened, powerless, sold like property. That woman could never have imagined facing down outlaws with a rifle or planning to break into a marshal's office for evidence. But that woman hadn't known what it was to be respected, to be taught, to be loved. She'd found all of that here, in a cabin on a disputed ranch with a damaged man who'd given her the tools to save herself. Tomorrow, she'd use those tools not just for survival, but for justice. And whatever came after, she'd face it as what she'd become, not property or purchase, but a woman who'd claimed her own power and chosen her own path. The Winchester sat cleaned and loaded by the door, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. But the real weapon, Grace knew, was the knowledge that she was no longer alone, no longer helpless. She was exactly where she chose to be. The plan came together in the dusty confines of Tess Carter's boarding house kitchen. Grace spread out the hand-drawn map of the valley, marking positions with coffee beans while Monroe, still moving stiffly from his wounds, checked and rechecked their weapons. The spring draws are here and here. Grace pointed to 2 narrow valleys. If we spread word about lost cattle in the North Draw, Maddox's crew will assume that's where we're hiding them. But we'll be waiting at the South Draw. Jonas Wright confirmed, his massive hands delicate as he sketched the terrain. The old line shack there gives us cover and high ground. Doc Everett shook his head. 7 of us against Maddox's gang, even with surprise. Those aren't good odds. 8, said a new voice from the doorway. Adelaide Morrison entered, followed unexpectedly by her husband, Frederick Morrison, the very banker they'd suspected of railroad collaboration. Monroe's hand moved to his gun, but the banker raised empty palms. "Peace, Mr. Monroe. I come with information, not threats." "Frederick." Tess's voice was sharp with suspicion. The banker looked haggard, older than his 50 years. "I've been a fool and worse, taking railroad money, foreclosing on good people. But when Adelaide told me what you were planning, what Miss Sullivan did at Devil's Cut..." He pulled a leather portfolio from his coat. "These are copies of every transaction between the railroad, Marshall Wade, and Cole Maddox, payments, orders, even a telegram discussing the Monroe problem." Grace took the documents with trembling hands. Here was the evidence they needed: names, dates, amounts, proof of the conspiracy that had terrorized the valley. "Why now?" Monroe asked bluntly. Morrison met his gaze. "Because I have a daughter, 16 years old. Last week, Maddox made certain suggestions about her when I hesitated to approve another foreclosure. That's when I realized what I'd helped create." His voice broke. "I can't undo the harm I've caused, but I can help stop it." They revised their plan quickly. The false information about lost cattle would still draw Maddox out. But now they had a second objective: getting the evidence to the federal marshal, who was already en route from Denver. "I'll ride north at dawn." Tom Garrett volunteered. "Meet the marshal's party. Make sure he knows what's waiting. And I'll make sure Wade is occupied during the ambush." Morrison added, "Call to an urgent meeting at the bank that will, unfortunately, last hours." Grace felt the pieces clicking into place, like rounds sliding into a cylinder. "What about the townspeople if shooting starts?" "Already handled," Tess said with grim satisfaction. "Prayer meeting at the church, organized by Reverend Phillips. Most of the families will be safely indoors." That night, Grace and Monroe made their final preparations in the cabin. She watched him clean his rifle, movement still careful but steadier than days before. "You don't have to do this," he said without looking up. "The evidence is enough. We could wait for the marshal." "Maddox won't wait." Grace checked her ammunition for the third time. "He'll run or fight, and either way more people get hurt. This ends tomorrow." Monroe set down the rifle and pulled her close. "When this is over, I want to do things properly. Church wedding, white dress, whatever you want." "I don't need propriety," Grace said against his chest. "I just need you." "You have me, always." He tilted her chin up. "But you deserve to be more than the woman I bought. You deserve to be my wife, recognized and respected." "Then ask me," she said simply. "Grace Sullivan, will you?" "Yes." She kissed him before he could finish. "Yes to whatever you're asking. Yes to whatever comes next." They made love that night with desperate tenderness, aware it might be their last time. Grace had come to his bed 3 weeks after their declaration in the storm, choosing the moment with the same determination she brought to everything. Now, with danger looming, their coupling carried the weight of promise and farewell combined. Dawn came too soon. The team assembled at the South Draw, as planned: Monroe and Grace, Jonas Wright, Doc Everett despite his age, the Garrett brothers, and, surprisingly, 2 more volunteers: Miguel Santos, who ran the feed store, and his son Luis. "Maddox burned out my cousin last year," Miguel explained simply. "Time someone stood up to him." They positioned themselves carefully. The line shack provided cover for Monroe and Tom Garrett, both excellent shots, despite Monroe's injuries. Grace and Luis took position among the rocks above, where they could create crossfire. The others spread out to prevent escape. The wait was agony. The sun climbed higher, baking the canyon walls. Grace's mouth went dry, but she didn't dare move for water. Below, Monroe held position with inhuman patience, the old soldier showing through. Then dust on the horizon, riders coming fast. 6, maybe 7, Luis whispered, young eyes sharp. Grace counted muzzle flashes from Devil's Cut. 7 men then, including Maddox. They'd taken the bait. The outlaws rode straight into the canyon, following the false trail Jonas had laid. Grace watched Maddox in the lead, his arrogance preventing him from seeing the trap until it was too late. "Cole Maddox," Monroe's voice rang off the canyon walls. "You're surrounded. Throw down your weapons." For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then Maddox went for his gun. The canyon erupted. Grace fired at the man flanking Maddox, saw him spin from his saddle. Luis beside her worked his rifle with surprising skill. Below, Monroe and Tom Garrett picked their targets with deadly precision. But Maddox's men were hardened fighters. They scattered for cover, returning fire that chipped rock inches from Grace's head. One outlaw made a break for the canyon mouth, only to run into Jonas Wright, who dropped him with a shotgun blast. "Havers is hit," someone shouted. Grace saw one of Maddox's men clutching his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. The firing intensified. Grace lost track of individual shots, focused only on keeping Maddox's men pinned. Her rifle grew hot in her hands. Below, she saw Monroe moving position, trying for a better angle despite his wounds. Then Maddox himself broke cover, not fleeing but charging straight at Monroe's position. Grace's heart stopped. She swung her rifle, tracking him, but the angle was wrong. Blocked by... A shot rang out, different from the others. Maddox jerked, stumbled, but kept coming. Another shot, and he spun half around. A third, and he finally fell, mere yards from where Monroe crouched. Grace looked for the shooter and saw Adelaide Morrison lowering a smoking derringer, her face pale but determined. She'd been hidden in the shack's ruins, a position no one had known about. "Gentlemen," the banker's wife called out coolly, "I believe your leader is down. Surrender would be prudent." The remaining outlaws, seeing Maddox fall, lost their taste for battle, one by one. They threw down their weapons and raised their hands. Of the 7 who'd ridden in, 3 were dead, including Maddox, 2 wounded, 2 surrendering unhurt. Grace scrambled down from her position, needing to reach Monroe. She found him standing over Maddox's body, expression unreadable. "Is he..." "Dead." Monroe holstered his weapon slowly. "It's over." But it wasn't. Not quite. As they secured the prisoners, a new dust cloud appeared. Grace raised her rifle again, then lowered it as she recognized the lead rider, Tom Garrett, and beside him, a man wearing a federal marshal's star. Marshal Daniel Price was everything Wade wasn't tall, competent, with eyes that missed nothing. He surveyed the scene, taking in the bodies, the prisoners, the mixed group of townspeople turned defenders. "Mr. Monroe, I received some interesting documents from Denver, followed by an urgent message from Mr. Garrett here." His gaze found Grace. "You'd be Miss Sullivan. The reports of your marksmanship appear to be accurate." "Marshal." Monroe stepped forward. "These men ambushed us 4 days ago, then came here following false information about stolen cattle. They've been terrorizing this valley for months at the railroad's behest." "So I've been learning." Price dismounted, his movements economical. "Mr. Morrison was quite forthcoming with evidence. Marshal Wade is already in custody, along with Mr. Hartley from the railroad. They'll stand trial in Denver, away from local influence." Grace felt her knees go weak with relief. It was truly over. The conspiracy broken, the threats ended. She reached for Monroe's hand, finding it already seeking hers. "There is one small matter," Price continued, his tone gentling. "The circumstances of Miss Sullivan's arrival here, while the evidence suggests she came willingly and has been well treated, the initial transaction with Mrs. Blackwood was, shall we say, irregular." Grace's heart sank. After everything, would the law still treat her as property? "However," Price continued, a slight smile creasing his weathered face. Given that Miss Sullivan is clearly of age and sound mind, and considering her exemplary actions in defending life and property, I see no reason to pursue that particular matter. As far as federal law is concerned, she's a free woman, making her own choices. Thank you, Marshal. Grace managed past the tightness in her throat. They spent the rest of the day dealing with aftermath prisoners secured, bodies wrapped, statements given. The town buzzed with news of the showdown. Some citizens who'd been too frightened to act came forward with their own stories of Maddox's brutality and Wade's corruption. That evening, in Tess's boarding house, they held an impromptu celebration. Morrison, looking years younger with his conscience clearing, raised a glass. To courage, he said, and to those who remind us what it looks like. To partnerships, Tess added with a knowing look at Grace and Monroe. To justice, Doc Everett contributed. Late but not too late. Grace stood, surprising herself. To choosing our own paths, no matter where we started. The cheer that followed warmed her more than whiskey ever could. Later, as she and Monroe walked back to their hotel room, the ranch was too far for night travel with his wounds. Grace asked, "What now?" "Now we rebuild the barn, the ranch, everything." He stopped walking, turning to face her. "But first, I believe I was interrupted last night." There on Main Street, under stars and street lamps, Elijah Monroe knelt despite his injuries. "Grace Sullivan, you saved my life in every way that matters. Will you marry me?" "I already said yes." Grace laughed through tears. "I wanted to do it properly. You deserve—" "I deserve what I choose," Grace interrupted. "And I choose you. Yes, Elijah, always yes." He stood and kissed her while passers-by clapped and whistled. Grace didn't care about propriety or reputation. She'd found something worth more than respectability. She'd found home. 3 days later, they stood before Reverend Phillips in the small church. Grace wore a simple blue dress borrowed from Tess, while Monroe had managed to find a proper suit. The church was packed, the whole town turning out to see the woman who'd helped free them from Maddox's terror marry the man who'd taught her to fight back. "Do you, Grace, take this man?" Reverend Phillips began. "I do," Grace interrupted, earning chuckles from the congregation. "Sorry, Reverend. I've been waiting to say that." Monroe's smile was radiant, transforming his usually stern features. When he said his own vows, his voice was steady and sure. "I promise to respect you as an equal, to support your choices, and to face whatever comes with you beside me as my partner, my wife, my love." When they kissed, the cheers shook the rafters. The reception at Tess's boarding house lasted well into the night. Adelaide Morrison had somehow procured a wedding cake from the city. Jonas Wright presented them with a handcrafted iron gate for the ranch, decorated with wild roses. Even Marshal Price stayed to wish them well before heading back to Denver with his prisoners. That federal judgeship Morrison mentioned. Doc Everett confided to Monroe. "Price is considering recommending you for territorial marshal. Seems he was impressed by how you handled things." Monroe shook his head. "I'm done with law work. Doc, just want a ranch and raise horses. Maybe raise a family." Grace overheard and slipped her hand into his. "That sounds perfect." As the evening wound down, Frederick Morrison approached with a wrapped package. "A wedding gift," he said, "and perhaps an apology." Grace unwrapped it to find a leather-bound ledger. Inside, the first page read, "Deed to the Sullivan Monroe Ranch, including all water rights, free and clear of all liens." "Frederick," Monroe started. "It's done. Filed this morning. The railroad can find another route for their depot." Morrison's smile was rueful. "Consider it a very small payment on a very large debt." That night, in their hotel room, Grace and Monroe lay entwined, marveling at how much had changed. "A year ago, I was ready to die on this mountain," Monroe said quietly. "Now I can't imagine being anywhere else. A year ago, I didn't believe I'd ever have choices, Grace replied. Now I have everything. We have everything, Monroe corrected, kissing her forehead. Together. Outside, San Gabriel slept peacefully for the first time in months. The threats were gone, justice served, and two broken people had found wholeness in each other. It wasn't the ending Grace had imagined when she'd arrived in that trader's wagon, but it was better because it was chosen, not imposed. Tomorrow they'd return to the ranch, to rebuild and grow and face whatever challenges came. But tonight, they had each other and the knowledge that some fights are worth having, some stands worth taking, and some loves worth every risk. Grace Sullivan Monroe had learned to shoot. More importantly, she'd learned to fight for what mattered. And what mattered most was lying beside her, scarred but strong, broken but beautiful, hers by choice and choosing. In the morning, they'd go home, but they were already there, in each other's arms, where they belonged. The spring rains came gentle that year, washing the valley clean of old blood and older grudges. Grace stood on the porch of the rebuilt barn, watching the water darken the fresh lumber. 6 months had passed since the shootout at the canyon. 6 months of healing and building and becoming. The new foals are settling in well, Monroe said, joining her with 2 cups of coffee. His limp was barely noticeable now, the regular work strengthening muscles that had atrophied during his years of self-imposed exile. Mary Garrett says 3 more women want to join the shooting classes, Grace replied, accepting the warm cup gratefully. We'll need to expand the practice range. Monroe smiled an expression that came easier to him now. Never thought I'd be running a school for armed women. Reverend Phillips still thinks we're courting trouble. Reverend Phillips thinks telegraphs court trouble, Grace said dryly. But even he admitted his wife sleeps better knowing how to defend herself. The shooting school had been Grace's idea, born from the letters that poured in after news of the canyon fight spread. Women from across the territory, some asking for advice, others begging for training. With the ranch secure and profitable again, they decided to answer that call. A rider approached through the morning drizzle. Tess Carter, her usual practical dress replaced by divided skirts, more suitable for riding. Behind her rode Adelaide Morrison and, surprisingly, young Catherine Price, the federal marshal's daughter who'd moved to town with her father's new appointment as territorial judge. Ladies, Grace greeted them. Ready for today's lesson. Ready to shock more proper citizens, Adelaide said with satisfaction. The banker's wife had become one of Grace's most dedicated students and fiercest advocates. Mrs. Weatherby nearly fainted when she saw me wearing a gun belt to the mercantile. They made their way to the expanded practice range, where several other women were already gathered. Grace recognized Maria Santos, whose husband had fought beside them at the canyon, and the widow Ellen Fletcher, who ran a small homestead alone with her 2 young sons. Today we're working on shooting from horseback, Grace announced. In a real situation, you might need to defend yourself while moving. Or while running away, Ellen said grimly, which is sometimes the smarter choice. Grace nodded approvingly. Exactly. Knowing when not to fight is as important as knowing how. As the women practiced, Monroe worked with their horses, his gentle patience with the animals extending to their nervous riders. Grace watched him help Catherine Price adjust her stirrups, saw the fear in the young woman's eyes transform into determination. You've built something remarkable here, Tess observed, reloading her pistol with practiced ease. A year ago, half these women wouldn't speak to each other across church aisles. Now look at us. It was true. The shooting classes had broken down social barriers that decades of town life had built. Ranchers' wives learned beside shopkeepers' daughters. Mexican women shared techniques with Anglo neighbors. Even a few daughters from the Chinese laundry had begun attending, though they kept to themselves mostly. Grace Riders coming, Luis Santos called from his lookout position, a habit they'd maintained even with the threats past. Grace shaded her eyes, then relaxed. It's Doc Everett, But who's that with him? The second rider was a woman, elderly but sitting straight in her saddle. As they drew closer, Grace felt a strange flutter in her chest. Something about the woman's bearing, the way she held her head. "Mrs. Monroe," Doc Everett called out. "This lady's come a long way to find you. Says she has information about your family." Grace's hands went numb. Monroe appeared at her side instantly, his presence steady as granite. The woman dismounted with surprising agility for her age. Up close, Grace could see intelligent blue eyes and a weathered face. Gray hair pinned severely back. She wore widow's weeds, but they were well made. Speaking of comfortable means. "You're Grace Sullivan?" the woman asked. "Born approximately 1856, left at the Sisters of Mercy orphanage in Kansas." "Grace Monroe now," Grace managed. "But yes, who are you?" The woman reached into her satchel and withdrew a photograph, old, creased, but carefully preserved. "My name is Margaret O'Brien. I believe I'm your grandmother." Grace took the photograph with trembling hands. It showed a young couple, the woman holding an infant. Despite the formal poses typical of old photographs, there was love evident in how they leaned toward each other. "Your mother," Margaret said softly. "Elizabeth O'Brien, and your father, James Sullivan. This was taken just months before they died." "Died?" Grace sank onto a nearby bench, grateful when Monroe's hand found her shoulder. "The sisters said I was abandoned." Margaret's face hardened. "The sisters lied. Or perhaps they never knew the truth. Your parents died of cholera in the epidemic of '57. You were barely a year old. I was traveling from Ireland, coming to help them establish their homestead. By the time I arrived..." She paused, composing herself. "They were gone, and you'd vanished. I've been searching ever since." The other women had stopped their practice, drawn by the drama unfolding. Tess moved closer protectively, but Grace waved her back. "How did you find me?" "The newspaper accounts of your heroics here. They mentioned you were raised at Sisters of Mercy. I checked every orphanage in 3 states, but somehow missed that one. When I read the story, I knew. You looked just like Elizabeth at that age." Grace studied the photograph, searching for herself in the young woman's features. "Why didn't the sisters tell me?" "Money," Margaret said bitterly. "I suspect someone was paid to hide you. Your father had enemies, union organizers who didn't like his labor activism. After his death, several of his colleagues' children also disappeared, adopted out quickly, records lost." Monroe spoke for the first time. "You have proof of this?" Margaret produced more documents, birth certificates, death records, even letters from James Sullivan to his wife. In one, he wrote of their daughter, "Our little Grace has her mother's spirit. She'll change the world someday. Mark my words. Asterisk. I have money set aside." Margaret continued. "Your inheritance, not a fortune, but enough to ensure you never want for anything, and I have a home in California. If you'd like..." She trailed off, seeing Grace's expression. "I have a home," Grace said firmly. "Here, with my husband. But I would like to know you, to learn about them." Margaret's stern face cracked into a smile. "I'd like that too, child, very much." They spent the afternoon talking, the shooting lessons forgotten. Margaret told stories of Grace's parents, how they met at an abolition rally, their work with the Underground Railroad, their dreams of Western land where they could build a community of equals. "They would be so proud," Margaret said, watching Grace demonstrate her marksmanship for the reassembled class. "You've become everything they hoped: strong, independent, fighting for others." That evening, they held a celebration dinner at the ranch. Word had spread, and half the town turned out to welcome Grace's newfound grandmother, Frederick Morrison. Ever eager to make amends, insisted on covering all expenses. Marshall Price attended with his family. Jonas Wright brought his fiddle, and soon the yard rang with music and laughter. "It's like a fairy tale," Catherine Price said breathlessly. "Lost family reunited, love conquering all." "Life's rarely that neat," Grace corrected gently. "But sometimes we get lucky." As the party continued, Grace found a quiet moment with Monroe by the corral. "Are you all right?" he asked. "It's been an overwhelming day." "I have a history now," Grace said wonderingly. "Parents who loved me, who died rather than abandoned me. A grandmother who searched for 22 years. She leaned against him. "A month ago, I thought knowing would change everything. But it doesn't, does it? I'm still who I chose to become." "And who's that?" Monroe asked, though his smile said he knew. "Grace Monroe, teacher, rancher's wife, defender of women who need defending." She turned in his arms. "Nothing about my past changes our future." "Our future," he repeated. "I like the sound of that." The party lasted well into the night, but eventually the guests departed. Margaret would stay in town for a month. She'd decided, getting to know her granddaughter before returning to California with a standing invitation for visits. As Grace and Monroe prepared for bed, she noticed an envelope on the dresser. "What's this?" "Open it," Monroe suggested. Inside was a deed not to land this time, but to a building in town, the old Masonic Hall, empty for years. "For your school," Monroe explained. "The ranch is getting crowded with all your students. Thought you might want a proper place." "Elijah, we can't afford—" "We can—" The horse sales this spring were better than expected, and Adelaide Morrison contributed, as did several others. They want the school to continue. He pulled her close. "You're changing things. Grace, the whole valley's different because you refused to be what the world tried to make you." Grace kissed him deeply, marveling again at this man who supported her dreams as fiercely as he'd once pursued his own destruction. Later, as they lay entwined, Grace felt the baby move for the first time. She'd suspected for weeks, but hadn't been sure until Doc Everett confirmed it that morning. She placed Monroe's hand on her still flat stomach. "There's something else," she said quietly. His eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Grace, are you—" "November. Doc thinks just in time for Thanksgiving." Monroe's whoop of joy probably woke half the county, but Grace didn't care. He kissed her belly, then her lips, then held her like she was made of spun glass. "I'm not fragile," she laughed. "Doc says I'm healthy as a horse. I can keep teaching until at least September." "Our child," Monroe said wonderingly. "Born free, raised strong, never to be bought or sold or limited by others' expectations." "Our child," Grace agreed. "Who'll grow up in a world we're helping to change." The rain had stopped, leaving the night air fresh and clean. Through the window, Grace could see stars emerging between racing clouds. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, students to teach, a school to establish, a grandmother to know, a child to prepare for. But tonight, she was simply Grace Monroe, lying safe in her husband's arms in the home they'd defended and rebuilt together. The girl sold to warm a stranger's bed had become a woman who chose her own path. And that path had led here to love, to purpose, to a future bright with possibility. "What are you thinking?" Monroe asked sleepily. "That I'm glad Mrs. Blackwood brought me here," Grace said, not for the reasons she intended, but still, every hard thing led to this moment. "To us," Monroe agreed. "To us," Grace repeated, her hand finding his. "And to everyone we'll help become who they're meant to be." The next morning brought sunshine and a new group of women eager to learn. Grace stood before them, Winchester in hand, remembering another morning when she'd barely known which end of the gun to hold. "The first thing to understand," she told her students, "is that this isn't about becoming violent. It's about having choices. It's about never being helpless again." Young Mary Garrett raised her hand. "Mrs. Monroe, were you scared the first time? Terrified?" Grace admitted. But courage isn't about not being scared. It's about acting despite the fear. And the more you practice, the more natural it becomes. As the lesson progressed, Margaret O'Brien watched from the porch, pride evident in every line of her weathered face. Monroe worked with the horses nearby, close enough to help if needed, but careful not to overshadow Grace's authority. This was her classroom, her domain, built from the ashes of who she'd been sold to be. Every woman who learned to defend herself here was a victory against a world that preferred them helpless. Every shot that rang true was a declaration of independence. The school would grow, the child would be born, the ranch would prosper. And somewhere in Kansas, the Sisters of Mercy would receive a letter and a generous donation, along with pointed questions about their record-keeping and a request to help other abandoned girls find their histories. But all that was tomorrow's work. Today, Grace Monroe stood in the morning sun, teaching women to shoot straight and stand tall, building a legacy of strength one student at a time. The girl purchased for silver had become a woman beyond price, and her story, like the ripples from a stone dropped in still water, would spread outward, touching lives for generations to come. In the end, that was the greatest victory of all, not just saving herself, but showing others they could save themselves too. The West was still wild, still dangerous, but it was also full of possibility for those brave enough to seize it. And Grace Monroe, teacher of courage, mother-to-be, keeper of her own destiny, would make sure they knew how. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect and discuss your thoughts about Grace and Elijah's journey. If you enjoyed this tale from the Old West, please subscribe to Wild West Night. Hit that like button, and don't forget to press the hype button to help more people discover these stories of courage, love, and redemption in the American frontier. Your support means the world to me, and I can't wait to share more stories with you. Until next time, partners.